The anime community at large has always been very picky about what's criticizable, what's good writing, and what's considered the best genre. And because of that, the Venn diagram of liked and actually good hasn't had a very large overlap. The best anime, according to this community, is usually old shonen shows like Yu Yu Hakusho, Neon Genesis, and JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. While I wouldn't call them bad by any means, only lacking because of unseen universal rules that their creators seem to think that they need in order to be appreciated as genuine pieces of art. This actually kept going past the late 90s and still permeates our media today. Jujutsu Kaisen's main protagonists is a passive group of people who willingly fight to support the status quo, at least until the final act, with only one real exception. That was one of the most popular manga up until 2023 and 2024 before it ended. Sure, there are other shows that have proactive protagonists, Chainsaw Man, Samurai Jack, The Boondocks, Regular Show, and The Clone Wars all come to mind, but I'm going to be focusing on my favorite. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure has had this issue since the very beginning of its conception. While it has waxed and waned over the course of the entire series, the proactivity of the protagonists only started to make a real difference in Part 5, Golden Wind. It was Giorno Giovanna's mission, after a youth of victimization, to both take revenge on the mafia that wronged him in his childhood and to make definitive reform to the status quo of Passione and Italy. Then in Part 6, Stone Ocean, it was Jolene's mission to escape prison, save her father despite being absent for most of her childhood, and then save the universe. Yes, I know, it's jarring. Then it slowed down for Parts 7 and 8 because Araki decided to play the long game again for some reason. Look, I know Hirohiko Araki is a little better at writing stories than I do because he wrote a book about it, but it's such a peeve of mine to see people writing passive main characters despite having a narrative they want to elaborate on, and they end up giving the main character a push with an entirely different character anyways. Johnny is definitely a well-written character, but when people love Gyro more, I think that might be a genuine blemish on your ability to initiate your main characters consistently. That being said, Araki has made major progress since the days of Stardust Crusaders, what I consider to be the worst part in the entire series. JoJoLands is probably my favorite part, just beating out Part 5. Go figure, it's the one that people say is supposed to be a parallel for. But not because Jodio is a reflection of Giorno, but because Jodio reflects me without being a blank slate, explicitly meant for projection. To immediately contradict my point earlier about Araki's growth as an author, I've seen fan-made comics on YouTube delve deeper into the psyches of the characters than Araki has done for any of his characters in the primary universe, save for maybe Dio. Araki may be amazing at setting up characters' distinct personality for their debut, but he has notoriously never been able to elaborate on that, beyond the examples I listed and a few more that I haven't gotten to yet. Johnny, Jodio, and Jolene are tied for the best written JoJos, and the best written characters for their respective arcs, and still, Araki needed to fridge Weather Report to really get there. Steel Ball Run is a great story, but I'm gonna hold off on calling it the best piece of written fiction that people are so quick to say, especially since Naruto, which is arguably a bad story to begin with, is better at progressive character writing. That being said, Jodio and Dragona have so much depth to them that I don't think most JoJo fans will bother to look into. Jodio and Dragona are obvious at a first glance, but there's a surface tension that you have to break through to understand them on a deeper level, and I can heavily relate to both of them. Speaking of which,
アメリカ合衆国ハワイ諸島これは一人の少年が亜熱帯の島々で大富豪になっていく物語 The JoJoLands.
Jodio Joestar is a 15-year-old boy diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder at a young age. He attributes everything in and outside of his life and scope of experience to the mechanism of trust. He clearly cares for the well-being of his family, but he doesn't really make friends in a particularly emotional way. He deals drugs to his classmates in his school and tries branching out to other schools and even universities, but that doesn't last too long. Jodio understands that trust is something he loves to have because of its potential benefits, and he uses it to lord over those who don't receive it from others. So he embraces his So he embraces his pre-established role of a mole and uses it for maximum profit. When people discuss Giorno and his alignment, they often say he's a gray or neutral character, when in reality he's lawful good. He's so streetwise that he understands that people who work in Passione are mostly profit-driven people who use their power to exploit those who can't defend themselves. The police also profit from it, so they stay out of mafioso affairs at best or assist in them at worst. He plots to make Italy a better place by taking over Passione as boss and cutting most, if not all, the drug trade. Jodio is rightfully described as neutral, as he follows all orders without question in order to increase his own profits. Jodio is an incredibly selfish, profit-driven person, where his only concerns are himself and his family, but this mask does crack a few times. Not to say he's lying to himself, but the mechanism of trust is something so universally widespread and deeply ingrained into the deepest parts of his thought process that he has no reason to question it. He perceives the mechanism so deeply in every part of society that it's almost like a higher power to him, which he's already been conditioned to blindly trust at the promise of profit. It even feeds into a sense of idolization. What I'm talking about is his unseen appreciation for people he can trust, despite surface level untrustworthy behavior or having never met someone in his life, which each happens once in these early chapters. The first is a moment where Usagi asks Jodio for drugs on the bus, where Jodio lashes out in a display of outward violence, but going out of his way to apologize to him before explaining that trades shouldn't be in a place like a public city school bus. The second is his confrontation with Rohan Kishibe, Araki's self-insert, about the lava rocks, where he preemptively states his appreciation for Rohan's writing and art before interrogating him harmlessly, after he had already called the cops on the gang in the middle of their robbery, and gains Rohan's trust enough for him to let Jodio keep the lava rock, which Rohan had kept in a safe with a $6 million diamond in it. Sure, these are transactionary exchanges to Jodio, but the fact that Jodio revels in the bonds that he's made in his time dealing drugs shows that he doesn't feel nothing for them. The people he doesn't feel anything for are those that didn't trust him in his trade in the first place, like the many people who have attempted or threatened to violate his family, and having his carefully earned trust broken by someone whose job it is to be a trustworthy source of justice or income. Jodio has had his trust broken and tarnished in such disgusting ways to his most closely held companions, his sibling, and to himself. He is in no way obligated to uphold a moral goodness where which those who threaten him or his family are concerned. Dragona Joestar, 18 years old, is a gender non-conforming person who likes to dress minimally but is in no way sexually promiscuous or intentionally sexualizing themselves for the pleasure of others. Dragona is, rather stereotypically, characterized as a bit of a gemophile. They're your basic girly 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 girl. I don't get the sense that they orchestrated the operations that they and Jodio go on before the events of the first main arc, but they do make sure to have all their bases clear as not to take the responsibility for any mistakes made or any mistakes possible. They're calculated in their actions, but easily distracted with materialistic possession. This goes to such an extreme that when they get infatuated by an $80,000 watch, they get so anxious about the condition of it before being nearly fatally struck in a surprise attack. Dragona isn't explicitly characterized as much, but they do have this air of complacency to them. They're willing to let bad things happen to them because they know that they can either safely get out of the situation or wait for it to die down before forgetting about it. Just like Jodio, there's two prime examples of their characterization. The first is their introduction, where Dragona asks Jodio not to kill the cop that just violated them, or the cop that stood there to watch it happen. While it was happening, they didn't say a word about it, just letting it blow over, either out of fear or complacency. The second moment is when Dragona and Usagi are interrogated about the watch I mentioned before, and Dragona gets stressed out over this exceedingly expensive object getting lost, and the two of them being blamed for it. But in the moment where they could be violated because of it, they were more worried about the watch, which was recently lost, and the lava rock, which is something that the gang believes is life-changingly valuable. Something Dragona quotes often is, "I'll never push myself too hard, but I'll never give up either," which is a fascinating gauge for their attitude, being that they don't actively look towards a particularly ambitious future, but they will do what they can to secure a position in the present. While Dragona isn't comfortably sitting still, hustle, they refuse to do anything to risk what they have now in exchange for a higher class livelihood. When confronted with the opportunity to make 40 grand in a week, the first thing Dragona thinks about is the little things that they can buy now. Considering Jodio and Dragona's backstory, it makes sense that Dragona would consider every most likely scenario and keep their protests silent, as to make sure all plans go accordingly. Dragona considers the object when reviewing a scenario, and not statistical possibilities, and takes advantage of the system even if they don't make it out unharmed. Materialistic obsession isn't something Dragona thinks is going to change their life. They know that it won't, and use that self-awareness as a way to justify how they live.
You boys are the homosexual supporting cast.
Usagi, Paco, and Charming Man are a little less nuanced, or at least from my perspective. I'll see what I can do about them anyways because I still like them and they deserve to be talked about, since they are a part of the Part 9 gang. Paco was the previous oldest of the group at 19 years old, and considering the rest of the team either has a clinically diagnosed neurological disorder, tried to sabotage or kill the rest of them, or socially withdrawled, Paco is actually the normalist one. While Paco is quick to anger, he's a rather trusting individual, even after Charming Man pulled disembodied cat heads out of a bag and tried to stab Dragona shortly after. He sees the cats were fake and decides Charming Man would be a good addition to the team. Paco is by no means the leader of the group. Contrary to my statement about Dragona not being the one to initiate jobs, their preference for certainty over possibility makes them great for planning ahead of time and specific events, which makes Dragona and Paco a good commanding duo for the group. Paco would certainly hold people accountable for the things that annoy him at the moment, most of the time, but he isn't one for grudges. As long as you are an honest person, he doesn't hate you. You might be confused by that considering he's always on Usagi's case about seemingly everything he says, even while he's dying. But at that moment, there was nothing he could do about Usagi's condition, and they were already headed towards a hospital, and Dragona was also getting attacked. Paco, in that regard, is similar to Dragona, and they have a bit of an influence on each other, being the two oldest before Charming Man joins the group. Usagi is a bit of a mixed bag. Not to say he's a mid character, just that he's so far unfinished. Usagi's an open book. He's not averse to saying what's on his mind, even if it's too detailed to be relevant. He also has a tendency to get really attached to others for similar interests of any kind, and later offers his friendship to Jodio, before he declines of course. Like I said, Usagi doesn't have much right now. He's 19 chapters in as of November 3rd, and he's only had about 5 chapters worth of elaboration. I like him and I want he and Jodio to be legitimately good friends at least by the midpoint of the series. As for Charming Man, he's even lesser in depth, and his backstory only goes to explain the origins of the lava rock, the introduction of absurdities, and his own motivations, which just boils down to a lost loved one recovery story. To say the least, I don't find him interesting enough to give him his own section. Charming Man's motivations and goals might take a turn later in the series, but we don't know how yet, because it's too early to call. At the beginning of the script, I didn't think Araki would have been so consistent with these concepts. I've never taken him for a particularly deep character builder. He's definitely good, yes, but character depth has always been on the backlines, outside of their visual representation. Much of the character development in JoJo's has always been consequences of major changes in the story, like the loss of a character's loved one, friends, family, pets, their memory, or in one particularly extreme case, the entire world and universe. Jodio and Dragona have been through multiple events which groomed them to prioritize some things more than others, and survived an event that changed the way they experienced the world around them forever. There aren't a lot of characters that take advantage of multi-dimensional development, and for some entire franchises paraded as universally good by their fan bases, they don't even make the effort to stay consistent with their tone, continuity, visual representation of information, or even the main character. Granted, most of the examples I showed are for a smaller demographic, and JoJoLands is a teenager series at its lowest, and an adult series at its recommended demographic. But the necessity is still there. If you aren't going to be consistent with your story, you probably shouldn't be adding unnecessary parts in your story anyways. Things like that can confuse an audience, and when the audience is confused, you can't move on with the story until you've sufficiently explained the part that they're confused about, which is something Araki does end up doing anyways. But in the case of these early volumes of JoJoLands, he did well. Even in one of my favorite contemporary manga, Jujutsu Kaisen isn't good enough to evade this internal conflict either. But the reason it's one of my favorite is because Geike Akutami's best character in it has a much simpler continuity that concludes quickly, and the audience gets to reap the benefits of her development by seeing her kick all kinds of ass. Another one of my favorites is Land of the Lustrous, where in a setting where time literally doesn't matter until the end of the manga, the characters can be as active or inactive as they want. The only character to be active is the main character. In contrast to everyone else, Phosphophylite is willing to change themselves to change the status quo. Hirohiko Araki wrote characters in a similar way, but with interesting twists, where the main character Jodio isn't in a position where he's ever out of his own element, so he's willing to do something new basically every day. This might end up backfiring like with Giorno, where he doesn't actually change much by the climax of the series, even if the depth he was introduced with was really good. I chose to cut out a lot of the points where I'm talking about myself, because that would have made the video both much more depressing and slow it down dramatically. That being said, I hope you liked this one. I spent a lot of time ruminating on both Jodio and Dragona, and there were ideas in my head that I really needed to convey. Since nobody was trying to make a JoJoLands video, I thought I'd be the first. I also decided to leave out my opinions of generally creepy weeb topics, but that's for another probably fandom related video, which I'm 50% excited for and 50% dreading. Outside of that, if you did enjoy your time here though, go ahead and do the thing. I love you and I hope you have a good night.